everybody, it's Romania Black, and we're on episode 5 of Psychopaths, the extended edition, or rather episodes 9 and 10 of the regular season 1. Yeah, oh man, last episode was pretty good, like getting into all sorts of artistic things, discussions, and Shogo seems not too amused by Oreo, so she had to go. She was not inspiring him like he believes his new potential boo, Kogami, can. I was like, oh no. So I'm really excited to see what's going to happen in these episodes. We're nearly to the halfway point of the season, if you can believe it. I may end up doing 2 episodes per go around with Psychopaths in future seasons as well, because I really like the 2-episode format. I like it a lot. It is a lot more discussion and a lot more content, but I really like the format of it because I think they surprisingly feed into each other rather well. And I don't know if season 2 will end up being like that or not. I don't know, but I really like it for season 1, especially so far. It's been really nice. And we have several seasons of Psychopaths. We have like 3 seasons. So it's not like I'm rushing through the content. There's a lot to get through. So I think that, usually in most series, I can do just 1 episode each because I'm like, no, that's enough. But here, I think the 2-episode format works rather well. So we'll keep it up for now, at least for season 1. And then if season 2 starts out and I'm like, oh, I don't feel it, then I'll change back to 1 episode. But for now, I like the 2-episode format a lot. I actually have a lot of comments for this episode. I left my notebook that has a lot of my comments I do for discussions on my channel. I left it at work and it's a holiday weekend and I can't go get it until tomorrow. So I'm like, dang it. So I may have some comments that I missed from the last episodes. I can't remember. I may have some comments that I missed in that notebook that I will bring up with episode 6. So just be aware of that. If you're like, oh, did you see this comment? And you said you were going to talk about it. If I said that and I didn't talk about it here, I will talk about it hopefully next week when I get that notebook back. But I was just like, So I realized it after I got home. By that point, my school was locked up and I'm like, I don't want to break in. But I do have some comments that I want to talk about. This person, RGRYT, over on YouTube, they shared, Mods and I talked about it, they shared Ko's file in English from episode 3. And the mods were like, do you want to know about this? And I'm like, okay, look. The fact that the episode itself gave us the file in Japanese, and I was like, man, I wish I could read that. I don't consider that a spoiler because they literally gave it to us. They literally showed us the file, showed us the text. It just wasn't translated because Crunchyroll didn't want to take the time to do it. And I don't blame them. So I was like, no, I don't consider that a spoiler because the show is literally giving us that information. We might as well know about it. So RGRIT was really nice, so thank you, and translated it into English. So we have Kogami. He's 28 years old. He's a Leo, born August 16th. So I'm like, of course he's a Leo. Why should we be surprised? Kogami, make them all Leos. He was a social psychology major. And I'm like, okay. That explains a lot of the Sherlock vibes, a lot of the detective work. He was a social psychology major. That all tracks. He, like Akane said in the episode, was ranked number 1 on the national exam, like she was. So him and Akane got a lot in common, And then in April of 2104, because this is 2112 when this is happening, correct? That's when this series is taking place. So 8 years ago, he joined the Public Safety Bureau. And then September of that same year, like only May, June, July, August, only like 5 months later, he was appointed to the 1st Division as a criminal affairs investigator. So just like Akane, Kogami rose through the ranks really quickly and was instantly put into this department. So there's a lot of eerie similarities between him and Akane. And then 6 years later, in February of 2110, so 2 years ago, he left the bureau after the Psychopaths after his Psychopaths rose after Sasayama died. Now, what's interesting to me out of all of this is this last part, because it says 2 months later in April, he was assigned back as an enforcer. So I don't know if it was just he was incarcerated and then it was just like the due process that he had to go 2 months and then was assigned back, or if Genoza, if Masayoka, if any of them had something to do with him coming back to the force, if Kogami wanted to come back himself. I don't think that once these individuals get labeled as a latent criminal, I don't think they get a lot of rights in terms of being able to advocate themselves to come back into the force. So clearly someone fought to get him back on as an enforcer. Was it Genoza? Maybe. I think it might have been. So I don't know. We'll have to see, right? But I think that's really interesting. Like, what happened in those 2 months between him leaving the force and coming back as an enforcer? I don't know. But what's very interesting about that is Kogami seems very, very, very similar to Akane in terms of his like rise through the ranks, in terms of his career choices. I don't think we know exactly what Akane's major was, but in any case, there's a lot of similarities between them. Is it fueling my ship of Akane and Kogami? Absolutely. If the abs didn't last episode, this definitely did. So yes. So thank you, RGRYT, for giving us that nugget of information. I'm glad you translated that. I appreciate it. Geen talks about, I was trying last episode to figure out what the music was, because I was like, I've heard this before. Is it Beethoven? It is Beethoven. It's freaking Ode to Joy. Everybody that's watched my Neon Genesis reactions are like, girl, you didn't know that was Ode to Joy? So, but I'm also like, oh my God, as if Shogo could not be compared to Kaoru enough, right? Or just make Kogami Shinji, Shogo is Kaoru, Ode to Joy is playing. What do we do with this? So yes, I was just like, oh my God, why did I not recognize that? My brain was fried. I'm gonna assume that was it. Kogami's smoking can be tied to addiction, which a lot of the world right now in Psycho-Pass tries to avoid because they don't want to make their hue cloudy. So we have Kagari drinking, we have Kogami smoking, these little vices that the world seems to ignore, they're frequently doing, because at this point they're like, their Psycho-Pass, their hue is already cloudy, their Psycho-Pass coefficient is already high enough. What does it matter at this point, you know? So I thought that was really interesting. And then apparently there was also a translation issue that Geen pointed out. Kogami uses genderless descriptions when initially talking about the culprit that we find out is Oryu. So at last episode I was like, oh, well, they keep saying he, like trying to throw us, the audience, off that they don't know it's her. But the reality is that Kogami was using a genderless description because he's a damn good detective, as Anime Annie points out. Yes. But the subtitles gave them a he, gender. Why should we be surprised? And then apparently the tattoo man that they visited last episode, their voice actor is the same voice actor as Dagon from Jujutsu Kaisen, as All Might from My Hero Academia, and Shadow from Skate. What a weird combo of characters. But I like that, so thank you, Geen. And then finally, Anime Annie points out that yes, Kogami is a dang good detective. He, like, even Genoza recognizes him as such. So I liked that. Also, Genoza and the others assumed that it was Toma that was behind this crime, potentially, whereas Kogami was a lot more open-minded about it. I feel like Kogami is, like, stimulated and excited by this case, and so he's giving it his all and treating it very seriously, and so he's not cutting any corners. He's trying to be as objective as possible, which I really like, and obviously Shogo is getting a hard-on about it, so what do we do, right? And then Masaoka's comment about no juvenile law, which I agree with Anime Annie. I kind of glossed over it in the discussion, but that is really interesting because it also ties back to Kagari, who was, you know, labeled a latent criminal as a kid. But it does beg the question of what do we do with children who are convicted of being a latent criminal? Do we put them in the gas chamber prisons as well? What does that say? So that's rather interesting. And then I do think that it's interesting that the series points out a lot of fictional versus reality motifs that are scarily relevant now. You know, this came out a decade or so ago, and this is really relevant now. I definitely feel like a big point that this series is making thematically is the idea of our persona versus our real self. So, for example, you have Spooky Boogie, who told Akane back when they were being interrogated that they have their avatar, but they also have their real life self and how they are different. And the Psycho-Pass, the Sybil system, seems to want to make everybody just, no, there's no persona, it's just, this is you all the time, right? This is you 24/7, and that's not always the case. And we look at, like, you know, fiction versus reality. I think the good thing that Anime Annie pointed out was the artist, the father as the artist versus Oryu, and how she interpreted her dad's work. She took it very literally and she was like, oh, well, my dad did all these macabre things with girls, so I'm just following in his footsteps and murdering these women and making them into art pieces. Whereas her father, as we come to find out, no, he had a very separate idea of artistic vision versus how he really felt inside. And I think he would have been very disturbed by his daughter's interpretation. So it's kind of like, you know, if you're asexual or on the asexual spectrum and you like reading smutty stories, yeah, you like reading about fictional characters getting in spicy situations, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you yourself wants to be in those situations. You just find it fascinating, find it intriguing, or just enjoy reading about it. But that doesn't have to tie to your own, you know, persona, right? It's kind of like, I feel like if I ever went to a convention, people would be like, oh, you want to talk forever and la la, and I'd be like, no. I'm actually pretty quiet, like when I'm in big group settings. Like I would love talking in front of a crowd, you know, but that's on a small stage with maybe a few people. So that's, again, a different situation. But if I'm in a big crowd and people are like all the time talking, I'm like, I just want to listen to you. I don't necessarily want to sit here and talk forever. So it is a difference between your persona and how you are in real life, right? So it is different. It's interesting. But yeah, I'm glad that Anime Annie that you pointed that out, because it's a very astute note to make. And I feel like Shogo realized that Oryu could not distinguish reality from persona, and he was like, time for you to go. You're boring me. I found someone much more interesting, which is concerning. So yeah, I feel like I've talked enough. I'm excited to see where this goes. I feel like anymore I need to just wake up and watch Psycho-Pass, because it's going to be a lot, and I need to just watch these in the morning. I try to do like a nighttime watch of Psycho-Pass, and I'm like, I need to do these on the weekend when I can like be like awoke, fresh, and when my batteries are charged, dive into this series. So that's what we're going to do. So we're not going to waste any more time. We're going to dive into episodes 9 and 10, extended episode 5 of Psycho-Pass, and we're going to do that here in 3, 2, 1, and let's do this. Okay. Oh my god. So this episode is amazing. I don't know if it's my favorite episode or not. It's hard to pick favorites. I really love this series quite a bit so far. I'm very much in love with it, and it's like right up my alley. It's detective crime noir. It's getting into all this philosophical stuff. It's got romance, maybe, depending on how you want to ship. And it's just talking about these really interesting, very relatable real world concepts that I'm like, oh, we're getting into some interesting stuff here. And what I appreciate about this villain that is the Hunter is not only the fact that his weirdness now makes more sense of how creepy he was. He's a cyborg, so it makes more sense now. But it's not just that, but it's that Shogo is so intriguing because he wants to be the third person observer. He wants to be the omniscient narrator, the omniscient third person observer that is in control of everything. That's the thing. Like when he's up there on the tower watching everything, he's controlling the Hunter as well. And Shogo does not want to take part in the situations. He seems like just somebody that wants to break things down philosophically, right? He just wants to break stuff down and observe it from above, kind of like a freaking god. And it's so interesting. What I like about Shogo as a villain is he very much has, and this isn't really a spoiler for Death Note, you kind of find out in the first episode, but he has a very light Yagami kind of vibe to him, to Shogo, in terms of how he wants to be in control and wants to like point out these things about society and these grand overarching things. And he wants to have like a hand in reshaping it seems, from behind the scenes, which is very much what Light wants to do in Death Note. But the thing about it is that the way that he handles his kind of like god complex is on a much more like subtle and like not crazy scale like Light. So I appreciate that. I like Shogo as a villain is very intriguing. He's a little bit hypocritical. He's a little bit flawed, but I like it. And the fact of the matter is Shogo doesn't really realize he's flawed. We as the audience just kind of like, the way you're going about this is a little bit questionable. But Shogo doesn't really realize it, which makes it that much more intriguing. So yeah. Oh my god. So let's talk about this episode. My dog is like, I've waited patiently for you to get done with the reaction so we can talk about it. There's a lot to go over. So we're going to start talking about this, but we might as well talk about how Kogami, we had Saiga the professor and Kogami Taiga Kogami is from Kuroko's Basketball. I'm probably going to confuse them forever because I like both. Their characters are kind of similar. If Kogami was in the Psycho-Pass world, I think he'd be like Kogami. So that's intriguing. But yeah, so the interesting thing is that, first of all, Kogami has been proven that, yes, Makishima exists. He's alive and well. He very much was probably responsible for Sasayama's death. He is probably the mastermind behind pulling the strings behind all of this. And Kagami's like, yes, all of my, I've not been a crazy person, is kind of like the validation that Kogami is getting, being like, I've not been delusional and crazy all these years in trying to find Sasayama's murderer. This guy exists. He's still at large. And he's still a problem. So he's like, I'm not crazy. It must feel somewhat satisfying for Kogami to be justified. And what's so impressive about Kogami's character is he doesn't just go up to Ginoza and say, yeah, I was right, what up? He doesn't do that. He handles it really professionally, which again it makes things so complicated with the whole latent criminal enforcers and inspectors deal, because Kogami is like, yeah, I'm a detective first. And I attribute that a lot to Akane. Kind of like, he said this early on. He's like, you kind of make me feel like I could be a detective again. I'm like heart eyes, like get it in there, please. I so hardcore ship Akane and Kogami so much. I ship them so hardcore. But then there is that side of me that's like seeing this one-sided toxic yandere romance with Shogo for Kogami, and I'm like, man, you just, because Shogo is like heart eyes for Kogami. He's just like, oh, yeah. Especially the halfway point, which I'm assuming was the end of episode 9, when he was just like, who, me? Like Kogami? What? Like, it's just the creepiest thing, but I'm like, I'm all for it. So yeah, he's just like, I like that we have this concept of mirrors and glass, and Kogami just looking, being like, and Akane gets a little emotional in this episode, very much emotional. The thing about it is her hue isn't clouded. She's still able to keep like a good head on her shoulder, which is so fascinating. I want to talk about a couple things. We might as well talk about Akane and Kogami, because they are in this, and how they are so similar. To the point where Ginoza's worried, right? Ginoza is very worried for Akane, and is anybody checking Ginoza's crime coefficient? Because he's been acting more and more off the rails as these episodes go. I thought he was starting to like ease up at the beginning of this one. I thought he was starting to ease up, but then he just gets right back on it again. I'm like, I was like, is anybody checking Ginoza? I'm a little bit worried about Ginoza, honestly, because Akane seems to have her shit in check, right? She's like, we were close. And Kogami's right. He's like, they are never going to find the body of Oryu. She's already a pipe. Like, they're not going to discover her at all. And so then what I like about this is Ginoza's like, I want to talk to you by myself, right? Let's talk about Ginoza. Let's put him up on the board too. So Ginoza, we're going to put him up here. Ginoza, I think it's interesting that he apologizes. He apologizes to Kogami in private. That doesn't seem like a big thing, but I think it is, because he didn't do it in front of Akane. He doesn't want Akane to see this kind of intimate, personal moment between Kogami and him, because him and Kogami have history. They were partners. They went to school together. They're like college buddies that became detectives together and now have had this power shift. And I think the thing about it is Ginoza is putting on a lot of fronts. Ginoza is putting on, we talk about persona versus how we really feel. Ginoza is putting on a front of trying to remain an inspector because of a lot of reasons, right? That Masaoka, MVP of this episode set, by the way, not only for Akane, but handling Ginoza at the end, being like, that's getting a little too sinister, let's stop. When the enforcer is telling you you're getting too sinister, I'm like, that's when maybe we should be doing some crime coefficient checks. But we're not doing that, because I don't think any of them want to do it, because they don't want Ginoza to become one of them. I think that Masaoka doesn't want that for him. Because here's the deal. The deal of it is, like, Ginoza, there is this stigma that he's trying to overcome. Right? There's this stigma that Ginoza is trying to overcome. And Masaoka talks about it with Akane, being like, he doesn't want to become a statistic. He doesn't want to become proof that if you have family that are latent criminals, that means you're going to become a latent criminal too. He's trying so hard to overcome that. But at the same time, Ginoza is seeing the flaws in the system. He's seeing all of these things that are proving what Kogami and Masayoka are saying to be maybe true, but he can't acknowledge that because that puts his own career in jeopardy. And it's this weird, again, dichotomy. We talk about dichotomies in this episode. It's this weird like standard of, do I follow my heart and what I feel, or do I keep with the system even though I know it's wrong? And Akane is starting to call out the system, being like, well, actually, and Ginoza is like, you can't do that or you're going to become an enforcer. You can't go against the system. So it's creating all these complexities, but Ginoza saying here that he's sorry. I like the idea. Again, Ginoza is constantly trying to like, he's always like up against the rail, out in the open, like trying to reflect. He's looking at the window and there's a reflection of himself. He's constantly self-evaluating and trying to keep himself in check. Whereas Kogami's just up against the banister like, man, it's no hard feelings. I know. Kogami knows how the system works and he's just kind of accepted it. He's like, eh. As long as he can chase after Makishima, he doesn't seem to care anymore. He's just like, whatever. And he's like, will you just say whatever you're going to say? Just spit it out. And that's when Ginoza apologizes. He's like, I'm sorry. And Kogami's like, why? He's like, it was me who got emotional. He wasn't your delusion. So I think that that's interesting that Ginoza, he is like teetering. He understands he's getting emotional. And that he is attached to Kogami and Akane. He likes both of them, and he sees how much Akane is similar to Kogami, and he worries about her falling into the same pit that Kogami has, right? That's the issue. And Ginoza, nobody's checking his crime coefficient, because I think it's kind of this weird understood thing that they don't want Ginoza to become the statistic, so they're just letting it go, right? But if that chief inspects him, I don't know what she's going to find, right? But I also think it's a reason why Ginoza went into isolation to talk with Kogami about it, because he didn't want Akane to hear that he got emotional, right? That he didn't want that out in the open, but he could trust Kogami to not say anything, which is, again, at the end of this episode set, he's like talking about maybe killing Kogami, which I don't think he really believes in, but he's just following protocol. But he trusts Kogami enough and has faith in him to like be able to tell him about this. Come on now. He's like, you took everything. If you took everything Enforcer said seriously, you'd be a poor inspector. That's how it is, right? I like there's so much double talk here that Kogami's like, well, the system tells you that you can't listen to us Enforcers. We're dogs, remember? Remember that owner-dog mentality you've been touting so far this season that is slowly kind of getting a little bit skewed? He's like, you can't trust us, right? I mean, Kogami being his friend points out the ridiculousness of this system and how it's not true. And he's like, it feels like my praise tail just brushed the tip of my nose. And I'm feeling pretty good right now, Gino. For the first time in a long time. Yeah, I like that Kogami's like, no, the system is hacked. But also, there's this interesting thing about hunter versus prey. Where with Kogami, the idea that Kogami is the hunter and Shogo is the prey is also this idea that Shogo feels that Ko is the prey and he is the hunter. So there's, again, we talk about dichotomies. You're the yin to my yang. You're the peanut butter to my jelly sort of situation. That Kogami kind of telling Ginoza, being like, look, in this Sybil system, everything is so clinical and sanitized. There's no hunter. There's no prey. It's this like equity-based system. But he's like, no, that's not how humanity is. Right? Humanity, there's always going to be a hunter and a prey. Right? So, so fascinating. Love it. Love it to pieces. Let's get past this OP, even though I like the OP a lot. So we go to this idea of this lecture hall where there's only literally 3 people listening to the teacher. There's nobody else here. So the rise of individualism encourages violence. So let's talk about some thematic stuff. We're going to put some thematic stuff over here. Themes. So the idea of individualism individualism encouraging violence. All right, I want to get through what this guy says here before we talk about it, because I was instantly like, oh my gosh, let's talk about this. Michael Wieviorka, a French sociologist. So we talk about Wieviorka. And this idea, they kind of explain the philosophy behind this here with this sociologist, where he talks about that an individual who cannot become the actor of his existence. So an individual needs to become an actor of his existence. Anyone that cannot do that can turn the impossibility, and it's like turning impossibility against himself. Who cannot. Okay, anybody who cannot become the actor of his existence can turn that impossibility against himself and resort to violence. Okay. I've noticed that a lot of the crime coefficient latent criminals tie to sociologists instead of philosophers. So I'm like, what does that say? Is this series got against sociology? What's happening, right? That's really funny. And so he's like, under the management of the Sybil system, what frightens me the most is that type of crime. Because the farther the motivation is from the criminal's personal desires. So with the Sybil system, we're going to talk about this. The farthest the motivation from personal desire. All right. And we get to see our guy, Saiga here. The farther it is from personal desire, the tougher it is for detectives to deal with. The tougher to deal with. Yeah, because, so here's the thing. That individualism encouraging violence. So you've got multiple things going on here in this one statement, right? That you have an individual that cannot be the actor of his existence, turning impossibility against himself, resorts to violence. So it's this idea, we've talked about it, about the persona versus reality, the person we pretend to be versus who we really are, right? So we have the idea of an actor versus reality, right? What makes this so complicated is the idea of the third party, right? Because if it's the third party like Shogo, that's what makes Shogo so difficult to detect and difficult to find, because none of these murders that Shogo is the mastermind behind or the person that's initiating them, none of these murders tie to Shogo's own personal desires. Shogo is not the hunter. Shogo is not Oryu. Shogo is not Toma. Shogo is not Mito. He's not any of these characters who are committing these murders for whatever reason. Shogo doesn't care about any of that, right? Shogo's just doing all of these social experiments to find out why people commit these murders and what their motivations are. And then when he gets bored with them, he's like, well, that was fun. Glad to know that's why they want the world to burn. On to the next one. And then he just keeps going. So that's what makes Shogo so hard, is because he is able to like disassociate himself from the people and the murders. He's not following any sort of pattern. He follows a pattern that you can kind of see how he detects people and kind of like chooses people who have these similar kind of like motivations, or they all have a secret desire to kill others. But that's really the only pattern, right? Other than that, like, he is just this third party looking down. And what I thought was interesting is I've been researching like a speech that I'm doing for the team I'm coaching right now, where we talk about curriculum. And the speech is kind of advocating against there's in the United States right now, there's certain extremist groups that are trying to encourage like customizable curriculum, meaning that it's curriculum that certain schools and certain parents can choose to teach their children. And oftentimes that curriculum is very extremist. It can be, typically it's very extremely conservative. But the problem with it is it's encouraging this idea that we as a society aren't learning a public education. And I know a lot of times that the word standardized and public education can seem negative, but a lot of times when you have a public curriculum, it is held up to a standard and it has to go through various channels to show that it's presenting correct information, right? And when you have a standardized curriculum, it's more public, it's more out in the open. You can easily see if there's misinformation there. The problem with individualized curriculum, and this is my teacher spiel for the day, is that because there's not like a standardization or a regulation, anybody can teach their kids anything, and it leads to more individualized sects of people. And that encourages violence because it's just teaching kids to follow the ideologies of their parents or specific groups. It is not regulated, misinformation spreads, and it can lead to encouraging violence because there's not like a sense of public. There's not a sense of community in that education. And so it's a very dangerous real world scenario, right? And a lot of times we think individualism is such a good thing, and it can be such a good thing, but then there are elements where it's really bad. And so I like that this series is kind of exploring that idea of, yes, we tout individualism and we tout personal agency and we tout going against the hive mind and the collective, but there are cases in which the collective can be a good thing. So it's like, this series is getting into so many complexities that I'm like, oh my gosh, I get really excited about it, right? That's my spiel for the day, my soapbox. And then we see, again, Kogami and we see Ginoza when they have like their little bushy hair and they're a lot younger, right? And Ginoza is instantly like, well, we have huge checks and crime coefficients, so why do we need to think about this other stuff? We'll just use the technology that's given us to solve the problem. Again, there's also this idea of using technology as a support versus a part of our being. And that's going to get talked about with the whole idea with the man that's the hunter that's become, a cyborg, is that we're, if that, with Ginoza's line of thinking here, he's like, oh, if we over rely upon this technology, it becomes part of our necessity of being. It's not just a tool, it's part of our functionality. Whereas, Ginoza seems okay with that because if that's the case, then Ginoza's like, oh, well, that's something I can control. I can keep that under check. And these other personal things like my family and genetics and stuff like that won't come into play. Whereas, Kogami kind of calls it out. Also, it's so sad to see Kogami with such like a clean cut look when we see him now as the enforcer and it's like not the case. And that's what the instructor's like, sure, yeah, you could use these tools, but changes can happen in an instant. And you can't rule out possibilities, of sudden outbursts of violence and the same time in different places. He's like, there's clearly, holes in the system. I like how Saiga and Kogami seem like on the same line of thinking. And Kogami really looks up to Saiga as somebody that he respects. And it's clear why Saiga quit and left and isolated himself as a hermit. He doesn't want to get put into prison. He's like, no, Saiga seems to have understood what the problems with the civil system were. And he was like, oh, I got to get out of here now before I'm targeted. And I'm going to go hide in the woods somewhere in this nice house. And bye, see ya. We're going to talk about the tents and everything too, right? There would need to be an instigator who could somehow slip past the eyes of the civil system. That's Shogo, right? That's him. And he's like, oh, Shinya Kogami. It's weird to see Shinya as part of his name. And so we see a couple others here, and he's like, if such an instigator appears, do you think that the current Public Safety Bureau is capable of effectively dealing with him? No. That's the question doesn't get answered, but the answer is no. Mm-mm. So I love that. Again, Akane and Kogami, she does not want to acknowledge she's going on a date. It's not a date. She doesn't have feelings for Kogami, but she has feelings for Kogami. And so, yeah, what's so interesting is these parallels between, you have the parallels of Akane getting attached to Kogami, and then there's the question, did Kogami get attached to Sasayama? I mean, is is Kogami our bisexual king in this series? I'm all for it. I'm all here for it. It fits perfectly because Shogo, if Shogo, you know, if we're talking about sexualities, real quick, if Shogo is gay, Akane's into Kogami, and she's, you know, our heterosexual cis girl, then if Kogami is our bisexual guy that can go both ways, I'm here for it. It fits his personality. I'm living, yes, please. But clearly Ginoza sees the comparison. Ginoza sees the way that Akane is around Kogami as a direct reflection of how maybe Kogami was around Sasayama. You know, he found him amusing. I love how Kogami talks about Sasayama was amusing, meaning that he was kind of like into him. You know, he was an amusing guy. For Kogami, that seems like he was into him. But then when he hears the friend say, oh man, you're that guy that she's just at a loss with, and he's like, that's how I am to her? I wonder if he's thinking like, you know, is he thinking that, is he tying that to his, you know, reflection of Sasayama? Or is he like, that's not how I thought about Sasayama. What? It's going to have to come out in the wash at some point how these two feel about each other. And I'm waiting for it. And we'll just see where that goes. But yeah, she's like, the fact that she says that these are putting into place a combination of all of her favorites. She wants to dress in her favorites around him. I mean, you know. If you weren't into him, you wouldn't dress to impress him. I'm just saying. And of course, I like that he's, the thing about the Sybil system that's interesting, and the thing about the AI, maybe not the Sybil system, but the AI secretary, is that they try to, like, again, talking about artificial intelligence and how it adapts and learns with what we learn. It's trying to, like, deduce and figure out, like, that she likes him and giving her suggestions, and then it has to recalibrate itself when she tells him that's not the case. Interesting, right? It's like just taking cookies and adapting itself. So yeah, then they're talking about on this set that they're doing like this fancy place. And they're like, is it too flashy or tacky? They're like setting up the interview with this man that looked super creepy, but now it makes sense why that they're like that. So then we have this, the chairman of the Tato Network Construction Corporation. So we have this construction corporation, and the interview is happening in a random location that's set up and staged. It's all a hologram. Like, it looks like it's outside at this bistro, but they were just testing out the hologram to be like in this big palace and everything, and they're like, oh no, that looks too flashy. That'll reflect poorly on their personality. It's the idea of the setting itself is being chosen to give out a certain vibe about the person being interviewed. That is crazy, right? The construction corporation chairman. And then my dogs are going crazy. Toyohisa Senguji. So Senguji is our guy. Senguji. I will probably just call him Senguji the Hunter because that seems a lot easier to say than Senguji. A company that works on underground redevelopment. That all makes sense now of why he has the hunting grounds, why he's tied to the subway. That all adds up. All lining up. Got it. Look at this. Yep, he was born in 2002, right? 2002 is when he was born. Oh my gosh. That part just makes me go like, oh shit, he's 110 years old. Oh my gosh. 110 years. So supposedly he only, well, we don't know exactly when the cybernation of him happened, but it feels weird that somebody that's like, you know, born in 2002 in our current timeline, like this is something that could legit happen. The whole idea of the cyborg bodies and like the minds being incorporated into these robot bodies and the souls and everything in that discussion is so fascinating because that's something that could legit happen in our own lifetime. Like this idea of him like cybernizing his body is something that could legit happen. And that's so fascinating to me because then it's like, well, what do you live for, right? And he's like, thanks for having me. The use of cyborg technology for medicinal purposes is commonplace, right? But it's rare to see someone like the chairman who, except for his brain and nervous system, is entirely cyborg. Yeah, that's why he looks so freaking creepy. Because it's just like, it's a robot. He's a cyborg except for his mind and nervous system. And it's just like this idea of immortality is so fascinating to me, because he talks about it's a mystery why other people haven't given up their limiting bodies. He's like, I can't age. I think it's also fascinating that someone that can't age chose to have this body and this, like, identity, which again, we don't know exactly at what point he became a cyborg. So this could very well be like, he could have been in his 60s when it happened. Like, it could have been only 40 or 50 years ago when this occurred. And so maybe that's how his body was at the time, and he didn't think about making himself look younger. And they're like, limiting. And he says, Plato said our souls were imprisoned in our bodies. Again, we go back to Plato. All these guys talking about Plato and the concept of souls being imprisoned in bodies. I mean, that is the big existential question, though. You know, like, when you pass, what happens to your soul? You know, because your body's obviously shut down, but what happens to your consciousness, your souls? Is there something after death? It's like a question that will keep you up at night, thinking long and hard about it and freaking out. And having existential dread. So yeah, it's a very interesting concept. So he's like, in this case, I mean, it's such an enticing temptation to be like, oh, well, even after your body fails, your soul and mind can transport into something else that can live beyond that. That's tempting. That is tempting, right? And then we immediately hard cut from that to Kogami waiting around, waiting for her to show up. It's interesting because Kogami has such a poker face. It's like, we don't really know if he likes her or not. He's very just like, he's so hardwired on the Mikishima case that we don't really get to see like what he thinks about her and if he's attracted to her or not. I'm sure he doesn't want to think about that because he's trying to solve this case first, right? There's no time. And plus, Kogami is a detective, and as big of a romantic as I am, I definitely understand that Kogami's like, I don't have time and I don't have the luxury of being in a romantic relationship with her. Because one, she's an inspector. That will never work. I'm going to always be a latent criminal living out the rest of my days. That's why the idea of immortality is not appealing at all to Kogami, because he's like, what would be worse than the idea of living forever as a latent criminal, unable to have a relationship with someone I care about, and unable to ever be anything but a dog for the system. He's like, why would I want that? And Akane tries to say, well, if there is immortality and people can live forever, then, I mean, what does that do to the idea of crime and punishment? Right? If immortality is on the table, how do we handle crime? Because if people don't die, what happens? I mean, if people can't die, then is there even crime anymore? Because lives aren't at stake. What do we do with that? That opens up like a Pandora's box of just, she just, you know, she had very kind of like goes the naive route of saying, oh, well, if we're mortal, then the living situations and the rights of latent criminals would be changed a little bit. I'm like, no, it would be drastically altered. So that's interesting. But I like the idea that he's just like, what's the point in living if I can't love people, if I'm stuck in this situation, right? And he seems just so calm and collected when she shows up. But he can't smoke because it's a security robot. She's like, you're in a bad mood already. And he's like, I can't smoke because of this security robot trying to bite me, right? And it starts to follow him, and he's like, what's your problem? And she's like, what was that about? And then it's just the fact that the robot's trying to keep him from leaving. And she says sorry, and she's like, don't worry about it. I'm curious too. So, and he's talking about, I'm finding new pleasures in my life all the time. Yeah, so this whole situation is that she picked him up without telling Gino, just because she wanted to investigate Saiga. And Kogami knows that this is going to get her in trouble. This is going to get her yelled at. And he's like, are you sure you want to do that? And she's like, I want to know. So it's sort of like Kogami knows that he's influencing her. But it's kind of like he's so curious, she's so curious. They're egging each other on, right? They're their own instigators. And it's romantic, but it's also like Kogami knows she's going to get yelled at. But he's like, you're a grown-ass woman. If you want to do this, let's go. Mm-hmm. So meanwhile, the one guy, Suguji talks about, I never expected that overcoming aging would lead to such happiness. Unless you embrace it, you won't understand. But I mean, there is a temptation there, but it's also very creepy in that it's like, you know, if you live forever, will you enjoy the small things in life, or will everything seem like a pointless dull to you? I don't think Shogo is in for immortality. I think Shogo would find immortality as just another link to the stress care problem that he's got. You know, he right now is like, everybody's so obsessed with just this complacency that they're not living their lives anymore and finding value in it. It just leads to this stagnation, and that is the death of humanity. And would immortality lead to the exact same problem, where everybody's like, nobody like has to worry about death, so there's no fear of dying, so there's no sense of finding the pleasures in life. It's just, you know, humdrum drollness. I don't think Shogo would be about that, right? I do find it interesting that the idea of the era of immortality, and then we cut to Kogami saying he's not interested. He's like, if you're a latent criminal is not the sort of thing, that's not the sort of thing you want to go on forever. And then Akane is like, well, would the rights of them improve with the social system? And then Kogami says, well, no wonder your psychopath stays so clear. You're so naive about such things. And she's like, oh, excuse me. Their flirting is hilarious to me. And so they're like, according to a survey, the majority of people have answered they feel reluctant to be more than 50% cyborg. But he points out, he's like, well, every day you're kind of reliant upon your electronic devices. You're kind of already there to a degree. And that part, like, I was like, no, that is so correct. Because not only are our phones, we are hooked to these things constantly for information. It's like a processing unit we carry with us all the time, right? Not only is that the situation, but the place that I work at, there was a day where the internet was down. We couldn't do anything at work. We couldn't check our emails that we depend on for communication. We couldn't file certain documents because we need to get on the internet to get into the network to get into the hard drives to do it. We couldn't get online to print out things that we needed to. It was just like, there was no point in us being there to work because everything had been digitized and put on like a scale of being required to have the internet to function, that we were just like, I guess we go home, you know? That's insane. How reliant we are on technology to get anything done. Insanity. Even to the point where now we don't have landlines. Most people have cell phones. So if there's no cell phone service, if you don't have your phone, you can't communicate. You can't look stuff up. Unless you got an atlas or a map. You don't know how to go somewhere. The reliance on technology getting brought up in this series is so scary because of how true it is. It's like, oh, huh. Right? And then there's the idea of like, if a credit card reader is down at a grocery store, you can't get groceries unless you have cash. Unheard of, right? So it's freaky. It's freaky how reliant we are on the technology throughout this. And it just gets brought up so casually, you know, in this. And he makes a really solid point. Like, the history of man's cyberization it's a matter of degree. It's already here. We're already experiencing it. So what's interesting that I find fascinating is that they go here to this private location and they're driving around, and Akane, as they go to this location out in the middle of nowhere, right? And we see these little tents set up where people are just kind of like living on the land away from everything. I wondered with the tents if those were maybe like latent criminals that had like escaped out into the woods living near him, and he was just like, yeah, let's get out of here. Like they were living off the land, off the grid, away from the civil system because they were afraid of that society. That's what I took the tents to mean, that it was just people living out there in the wilderness because they didn't want to be reprimanded by the system. Could very well be. Kogami's awfully quiet when they go here. I'm like, I guess Kogami could run away to here, and says it's private property, no trespassing. And there is some technology there to monitor, right? To show somebody's here. I feel like, yeah, that's the case. Beautiful house. Like very like, it reminds me of, there's a Chicago architect that it looks like it's based off of. But yeah, and there's even little parking spaces for the house there. So curious. Curious. I wonder, since he was a psychologist, if maybe he saw patients here at his home at some point. And he's like, it's me, Kogami. And he's like, yeah. And she's like, there's not much environment hollow. And he's like, he doesn't like hollow stuff. Yeah. So this guy's become a hermit, and he has a mask on when they approach him. Like, he doesn't want to like use technology. He's trying to like live as much off the land as he can. Love it. Love this guy. Nice house though. Let's be real. He's like, stop calling me professor. Oh, no, it's not a mask. It's his scarf. How many years do you think it's been since I quit? At least 6. And then he's like, an inspector. I'm nice to meet you. And he's like, oh, so you brought an inspector here. Interesting. I love his house. He's got like the books, the globe. He has CDs. He has a lot of like physical technology. Yeah, and he's got like the coffee maker. It's like all very old school, right? I love the windows. I love the windows like showing nature and everything. Like he's kind of, it's more like our time tech with everything. It's beautiful. I like Saiga's character a lot. He's like, all I've got is coffee. And he just has a simple computer. Mostly it's like a library and a study. And him being a psychologist, it's apparent why Kogami is so drawn to him, because they're so similar in their interests. And then he like reads her like a book. It's very Sherlockian. I can see where Kogami gets it from, saying she's a grandma's girl, her parents are alive, all of this, they were opposed to you joining, blah, blah, blah. Interesting. And he's like, you fit that pattern, Miss Tsunemori. You're as sharp as ever, Mr. Saiga. Yeah, I love it. She's like, how did you do that? And I love that Kogami's so pleased. And he's like, it's through simple observation. It's just deduction. I love it. I love the relationship we see just by like how at ease Kogami feels around him. Just how like calm his demeanor is. Like you can tell he's learned so much from him. It's so good. He's like, people manifest signs unconsciously. Love it. Once you get the knack of it, you can easily read those signs, which is how Kogami has been investigating and deducing a lot of the things around him from what Saiga's taught him. Joji Saiga. She's like, your expertise is clinical psychology. And he's like, yeah, I was a psychiatric examiner and I worked in investigations and such, but I shifted to crime research before I knew it. And that's when Kogami's like, he's like, ask me anything. And he's like, I want you to give this inspector an intensive short course. Things like profiling. It's an outdated method, but I'm interested in it. And so, yeah, she's seen just how easily Kogami can investigate. And she's like, wow, this seems like a technique that I should know about. It seems a little old school, but what could be the harm in learning it? Even though Gino's is like, please stop. And she's like, oh, I became interested recently. I'm like, yeah, because it's Kogami. She blushes and everything. He's like, I'm a hermit, so sure, I'll teach you, whatever. And he's like, what's the other one? I want you to see a list of past course attendees that you keep with you. They want to see if Shogo was one of the attendees. And he's like, no, this is a personal request. And he's like, good, I'll help you, but not the system. I like it. He's like, if it was an order, I would have turned it down. Which is so fascinating because it seems like, you know, Kogami's an enforcer. So does Saiga know that? Does Saiga know that Kogami is not an inspector anymore? Because he never really talks about it. And if he quit years ago, he wouldn't know because Kogami just became an enforcer 2 years ago. So it's possible that Saiga doesn't know that Kogami has... I say it's possible he doesn't know, but if he can deduce things as quickly as he can, he probably does know that Kogami's not an enforcer anymore. Is not a detective anymore. He's an enforcer. But I think that makes it all the more poignant because he doesn't care. That means he doesn't care about the civil system, so he's like, sure, I'm going to help you. You're a detective either way. Screw this enforcer versus dominator bullshit. Like, I'm just going to give you the info that you want, as long as it's not something that has been ordered from above. Love Saiga. Love him. So yeah, he's like, who are you looking for? And they're like, the guy is the worst criminal since the creation of the civil system. And he's like, what do you mean? He's a high-level intellectual and has good health and probably physically fit with unique charisma. He rarely kills people with his own hands and controls other people's minds and influences them. Yes, Similar to Johan, right? He's like a music conductor and orchestrates one crime after another. And then he's like, well, explain what charisma is. He's like, it's the nature of a hero or a ruler. And he's like, no, there's 3 criteria, so it's not just that. He's like, you're a third of the way there. It has 3 elements. The nature of a hero or a prophet. So we get the idea of charisma. Do we think that Shogo has charisma, uniqueness, nerve, and talent? Mm-hmm. Yes. Do we think that Kogami has charisma, uniqueness, nerve, and talent? Perhaps. So the criteria is that it's a hero or a prophet. So yes, Shogo definitely believes he's a prophet. I think he believes he's more the prophet than the hero. I don't think Shogo believes he's the hero in any case. Now, Kogami may think that he's the hero, but Shogo believes a prophet. It's the ability to make you feel good when you're around them. To make feel good when around. Which, yes, Shogo clearly attracts these people to him because he makes them feel good, right? I don't know if Kogami meets that criteria because I don't know if he makes them feel good when he's around them. He can be kind of off-putting, so maybe not. And then it's the idea that their intelligence to eloquently talk about all sorts of things. So they're also eloquent. Yes. I don't think Kogami fits the second criteria as well, but he definitely fits the first one as the hero, and he's super intelligent and has gotten Akane's attention because he can talk about all sorts of things. Not about eloquently, but enough, right? And so he says, how do you think this is? Meanwhile, we find out that the art teacher, Shibata, which the art teacher, that's who Shogo was impersonating, no wonder he got close to Oryu, was being imitated by him. And he's got light colored hair, so he's able to fool everybody. All makes sense. And then all the video footage has been erased. Imagine that. I like that when we go back, I liked in this episode that we not only had like the bumps in the road that were being imitated as they were driving. That was a really cool little tiny animation effect. I liked that. But then as they're going back, like Akane's about to fall asleep. Like she's just like, what a day. Like she's got her little legs tied up to her and she's about to fall asleep. I like that this is kind of like a Tesla car. It can drive itself. It doesn't really necessarily need a driver. And then Kogami's like, well, did it help you at least a little bit? And she's like, oh yes, sure. I wasn't falling asleep. Yeah. He's an incredible teacher. She's like, I don't understand why his lectures aren't in the archive. And Kogami is like, well, they would never put them in the archive. And she's like, this was around the time that the Sybil system and the university system existed at the same time. So we've got, again, these ideas of 2 trains of thoughts, the university system and the Sybil system. And his way was kind of becoming the outdated way because it was increasing people's crime coefficients. His special courses were set up for investigators, but one day a big problem came to light, and that's that their crime coefficient got clouded and rose because of the attendees. Not everyone's did, though. I'm assuming referring to Ginoza, but enough did that they banned his courses. A one-on-one lecture like the one you had today is not possible, but it's hard to cloud your hue, so lucky you. And she's like, to think that listening to a lecture could raise your crime coefficient. Yeah, I mean, that's what communication can do to people. It's like just listening to people talk can raise your crime coefficient based on how you react to it. Hearing somebody lecture can affect the way, I mean, if you think about going to a rally and listening to one person talk, like rallies are basically lectures, right? So if you think about going to a political rally and how people's emotions can get stirred up by listening to somebody talk, that's just one person lecturing on a stage. That's literally all it is. So it's definitely possible, and I like that they're talking about that in this episode and bringing it up. And Kogami says there's a dark swamp and you can't see the bottom. To check, you have to jump in sometimes, which is what happens later on when they go into the tunnel and into the subway. And he's like, Mr. Saiga's used to it since he's dived and investigates so many times. But you have, I mean, again, it's such an interesting setup because Saiga, he is able to get himself out of it and condition himself. And I think that's because he's a clinical psychologist. He can separate the fiction from fact, right? But then you have somebody like Masaoka who dove in so many times, and somebody like Kogami that dove in so many times, they couldn't get back out. They couldn't change. So that's very interesting how individualized it is. Not all of his students can come back up safely after diving in the swamp. And there are gaps and simply their suitability. And she says, you seem like somebody who could dive deep. And he's like, He like does the little thing with the watch. He's like, you can see that that's not what happened. I couldn't come back. Or according to Sybil system, I couldn't. And she kind of smiles at him like, well, Akane, she's like, she believes she has so much faith in him, right? Meanwhile, saying, which animal do you think is the most cunning and does not risk extinction? No matter how many times they're hunted and killed. Well, that's humanity, of course. Also, it's really super creepy how Senguji is just like clinically putting his gun and musket back together. It's freaking creepy. And he's just talking about hunting with the dogs outside. The cyborg dogs make all the sense now. And then he has all of these like human bone pipes. And like it's like he gets the souls of his victims through the pipes. Creepy as hell. Nope. Not a fan personally. The souls of my prey give me energy. And Shogo just doesn't seem as, he just kind of is like, I feel like Shogo, he gets to a certain point with all of his victims and then he's not impressed anymore. He's kind of like, oh, so this was it? Okay, whatever. This is all you got for me? Whatever. And he's like, you've overcome your body aging and all that's left is your mind. And he's like, yes, of course. To maintain a healthy and sound life, you have to be able to sacrifice others' lives. But if people only seek youth for their bodies, and lose sight of the means to cultivate their minds, then naturally it will only lead to an increase in the number of the living dead. Yeah, so it's like these people that are just trying to like preserve their bodies. He's talking about like the stress care sickness. He's like the people that are only trying to preserve their bodies, they're just going to become the living dead because they're not trying to. It's like the Sybil system and the psychopath thing is trying to preserve people's bodies and keep them from dying, but it's not stimulating their mind and they just end up becoming the walking dead. Literally. He's like, rather than doing what he's done and preserving his mind and forgetting the body. So it's like the energy that comes from the thrills is a dangerous reward that goes hand in hand with death. Yeah, it's like people that skydive, people that like thrill seek. It's like, there's a chance of stuff going wrong, but you just seek that adrenaline high. You get on roller coasters. It's the same concept, right? You have Shogo over here with his Demon Barber Fleet Street knife. The tougher your prey is, the fresher the youth you can gain from it. Oof. And so then Shogo's like, well, I can arrange a hunt that you'll be all about with Kogami. But the thing about it is, Shogo, at first when he was like, oh, it's going to be this random inspector, I was like, would he really want Kogami to die? But now that we've seen the other episode, it's like, no, Kogami, I think Shogo knew he was going to best the hunter. And that was the goal. He was like, well, if Kogami can't best this hunter, then what's the point of me going after him? I want him to prove that he's the kind of prey that I would want. Creepy stuff, y'all. Creepy stuff. And he's like, oh? And it was like, it's an enforcer, yep. And then we cut back to, and of course Gino is like with Kogami at the back being like, oh, you took her out, huh? Okay. I feel like Gino is kind of like a big brother to Akane, where Gino's like, you knew better. You knew you shouldn't have done this. What are you doing? It's like Gino and Kogami give off sibling vibes a lot. And Kogami's like, I know you like this girl and she likes you obviously, but dude, you're putting her in danger. Like, what the fudge? And he's like, I heard you brought Tsunemori to Joji Saiga. And he's like, yep. And she's like, well, I asked him to. And he's like, what are you doing? He's like, are you trying to drag? And here he kind of talks over her. He's like, are you trying to drag her into your problem? And making her a latent criminal who strayed from the path just like you. And she's like, quit treating me like a child. And in this moment, he does kind of like I get that Ginoza wants to keep her safe. And he is very much afraid she is going to end up exactly like Kogami. And Ginoza's like, I've watched my father become a latent criminal. I've watched my best friend become a latent criminal. Now I have you that I care for kind of like a sister. And if you become a latent criminal and I'm the one left to watch over y'all when I very much am trying hard not to become a latent criminal, he's like, what does that say? So I get where Ginoza's mindset is. And he's like, as a matter of fact, you are a child, a brat who's confused about everything and anything. And I was like, whoa, that's going too far. I was like, Ginoza, you need to check yourself. And I like Kagari's like, yeah, getting out like the Tutti Frutti, like the Tic Tacs, like, come on, the jelly beans. It's like, why do you think we have inspectors and enforcers as classifications? You're supposed to be controlling him. It's in order to avoid the risk of having healthy people, psychopaths, get clouded by criminal investigations. We use latent criminals who can never return to society in our place. And Kogami's just like, Kogami is so, I respect Kogami a lot because he's so quiet here. Like, he knows, everybody in that room knows that Ginoza is just spouting off all of this textbook bullshit because Ginoza doesn't want to become like them. And they all respect Ginoza enough to let him have his way because they don't want him to become a criminal too and become a statistic. Which says a lot for them, right? But Akane doesn't know that. And he's like, that's why you can fulfill your duty while protecting your mind. Just use them. They're tools. And she's like, well, that's not teamwork. I don't want to use them like tools. She's like, solving crimes or protecting our own psychopaths, which on earth is more important? And he's like, well, if you don't want to throw away your career, you'll choose protecting your psychopaths. Are you going to sacrifice everything you've built so far? And she suddenly is like, well, I like that she thinks for a second. She's like, you know what? You're being a bit childish yourself because she's like, I'm not your subordinate. She's like, you're treating me like an enforcer when we are supposed to be inspectors together. And she's like, I'm on equal footing as you as an employee. So hold on. She just basically does a check yourself moment. She's like, check your privilege. And she's like, it's true that I'm new, but you are a respectable senior to me, but we are on equal footing in terms of rank. And then Kogami's like, oh shit. She's like, I'm managing my hue just fine. She's like, you may be a senior, but I'd like you to restrain yourself from questioning my ability and workplace in front of the enforcers. And everybody's just like, oh shit. Because yeah, I think that they're all avoiding, like, Akane's basically saying, if I checked your hue right now, would you be as unclouded as mine is? Because it's not sounding like it. And they're all like, please don't check. We're trying to, they're all trying to like play the game and be like, no, Ginoza's fine. We don't have to check him. He's okay. But she's just like, check yourself. I'm doing just fine. You're the one that's getting riled up. And then he just walks out like, nope. I'm not gonna mess with this. She's like, I can't believe him. And she goes to like tell the authorities, and Masayoka's like, no. Let's not file it with the bureau chief. He's like, any chance of passing on that, Missy? Let's not do that. And he's like, no. We're gonna go this way. And she's like, oh. She's like, all you bitches with your gossip and all your inside stuff with one another. Nope. Also, I like that we have, again, we talk about addiction. We've had Kagari drinking the alcohol, which is an addiction. We have Kogami with the cigarettes, which are an addiction. And now we have Masayoka with the coffee, which is an addiction. Yes. So, there we go. And he tells her the story about Ginoza. And Ginoza just had to clear his head. But yeah. Mm-hmm. He doesn't get better after this, though. He gets even more riled up later on in the episode. And I like that Akane's like, I didn't know that about him. And again, we don't know why Masayoka has the metal hand, right? He says if your psychopath gets clouded, those people will suffer the same hardships that Nobuchika did. I like that Masayoka calls him on a first name basis. It's like, like Kogami says Gino, which is a nickname, but Masayoka knows him on a first name basis. I'm like, oof. That shows like how intimate their relationship is, right? Is Nobuchika the son of Masayoka? I don't think so, but that's fun. It seems like he's almost like a father figure to him, which makes it all the harder, right? So yeah, basically Masayoka's like, if you get your hue clouded, then your family is going to go through the same hardships that his has. So don't do that. You know? He's like, in order to avoid that, that's why we're here, to keep this from happening to you. And she's like, do you think that Kogami thinks that way too? Do you think he thinks the same way that you do about all this? And he's like, he used to, but now I think that he's only obsessed with Makishima. He's oblivious to everything not related to him. Yeah, I think that Masayoka's like, look, I think that Kogami used to think like me and Ginoza and want to keep you out of this and keep you safe. But he's so hyper fixated in the swamp with Makishima that he's dragging you with him whether you realize it or not. And I think Ginoza realizes that, you know, Kogami's so obsessed. Masayoka understands it. They're like, he doesn't mean to do you harm, Akane, but he's dragging you into the swamp whether you realize it or not. And it's all because he knows that you can help him find him. And it's not that he's using her intentionally. It's just he's so obsessed he doesn't realize it. Right? Meanwhile, Shogo is very aware that he's dragging people in the swamp to get to Kogami. He's the polar opposite. He's very hyper aware that he's doing it. And Shogo's like, sure, don't capture him alive. Go for it. He's like, why would you capture him alive? And the hunter's like, well, you may not have noticed, but I'll tell you this. Shinya Kogami, when you speak that name, you look quite amused. And he's like, oh, who, me? Who, me? Like this little old me amused by Kogami? What? Oh my God. Oh my God. It's like, no, it is very hyper apparent. So yeah. And so he's like, I stand in a place that is light years away from this world's crime and punishment. Your usual means are not enough to catch up to me. And in order to do so, you have to have an accurate compass and map inside your head. Shogo's like, the only way to catch a criminal like me is to have a moral compass that is able to pinpoint and get on the same level as me. And so he's like, are you going to be the one that can catch me, Kogami? That's what I want to make sure of. Oh my God. So yeah, he's like, he's like, I've always been alone as a child. I was like, oh my God. So I've always been looking for a friend to be on the same level as me, but I want to fight and compete first. And then if you can manage to get past that, then maybe we can become bosom buddies. And it's like, oh my God. And there's the fact that he's like just stroking the picture of Kogami on his phone. Yandere indeed. He's like, what level are you? Are you at my level? Oh my God. Sometimes I find myself wanting to determine my level. Oh my God. And wanting to test my position and strength. But he's in the shadows there. We can't see his face. You're going to help me do that, won't you? He's like, I can't test my level and my strength until I can tell that you and I are able to get on the same level. And then if we can, then we'll fight. So it's like that opening scene in episode 1. This is all leading up to that, of these two meeting face to face and fighting one another. But obviously, we're going to know by the end of this that Kogami and Shogo get on the same level. It's just what's going to happen in the meantime. Is the friend going to die? What's going to happen? Kogami's by himself at the end. So what do we do with that? I don't know. We'll have to see, won't we? Goo. But yeah, so then we have the idea that somebody has hacked into Akane's account and sent her an email from Funahara, which honestly, at this point, the fact that Shogo was able to, using others like Cho, infiltrate into the apartments of people like Mito and them should not come to a surprise. They can infiltrate in other people's apartments. It's creepy and I don't like it, but it seems very obvious. So, and then of course, right, the idea that Akane gets Kogami to come with her to go investigate. They didn't tell Gino or anybody else. They did it, which I'm like, Kogami, you are a bad influence on Akane. Her not telling, because if she had told Gino, he probably would have not, I can see why she didn't tell Gino, because she didn't want to make this a case, but also I'm like, Akane, girl, you've just been lectured. But she's as bad as Kogami. It's like she's getting deeper into the swamp like he is. She just happens to have a good hue that hasn't been clouded yet. But I'm like, is that going to be a thing that happens with her? What do we do about that? Are her and Gino's hues going to get clouded? And then do they tell the higher ups? What do we do about this? But I'm like, girl, you are getting in the trenches. What are we doing? And Kogami, again, Masaoka, like he said, Kogami used to care. And the Kogami of the past would be like, we shouldn't be doing this. But now he's so fixated on seeing if this has any ties, possibly to Shogo, that he's going to go along with her. I'm like, And then they get here. And I feel like Kogami is also smoking and trying not to tell her that, the way she was describing it in the car, it seems like Kogami wanted to say your friend's probably dead now, but he was being respectful for her enough to not say that out loud. And then obviously it makes sense why he would go in ahead of her, because if he finds the body first, he's like, Because Kogami, with his experience with Sasayama, if I was thinking that Yuki would be dead. I thought she'd be dead and in some like creepy pose like Sasayama was. So I could see why Kogami decided to go ahead of her and not let her see, because he didn't want to see her have that same reaction. He's seen her get mad at the distant classmate's death or get affected by it. So he knew that if she saw her best friend get killed, it would maybe affect her like it did him. And he didn't want her to experience that. So funny how that all works out. There's also some very creepy imagery with the naked bodies holding up the plate right outside the train station. Very creepy. And again, this is part of the town that's not been developed in 60 years. Nobody's been here. There's like old stoplights, old landlines, electric poles that have all kind of rusted and faded. The dichotomy between the nice new parts of town and the parts they've just let kind of go are very interesting. Right? And yeah, it's a trap. And so she's like, what are we doing? And he's like, you're a detective. Let me go in. I'm the enforcer. And she's like, you're going to be like Gino too? And he's like, yes. And then of course, she authorizes him to use his weapons. But when he goes in, the security gets jammed and he keeps going, but she doesn't know it. And then he finds her. And of course, when we cut back to her calling for reinforcements, Gino is just off to the side. Like, you can tell Gino's just stewing. Gino's just mad at this point. He's mad that after everything that went down the other day, after everything that happened, he's like, you still went with Kogami? You didn't tell me. Now he's gone. And Gino, again, Gino is such a ball of emotion right now. Everybody else is just kind of like, well, I guess we'll find him. It'll be all right. He's probably right as rain. We're all good. And Akane's worried about him. Gino is the most worried. He's over there sulking by himself. He probably is worried about Kogami being in danger. He's mad because Kogami went off with Akane again without telling him. He's mad because Akane is going to use her position as being the same as him to justify it. He's mad he can't do anything else about it. So he's just freaking out internally. And nobody's checking his crime coefficient. They're all just letting Gino have this moment. And they're like, well, what do we do? And I like that Kagari's like, well, is it a problem with Akane the navigator? And then Kunazuka is like, well, no, it's probably the software. It's probably like the schemats and everything that's the problem. And so Gino says, Kogami left your surveillance and his location is lost. In other words, he might have staged this situation from the start in order to run away. And he's like, we can't let enforcers run away from us. Gino knows that he didn't run away. Gino knows this. He's just being so by the book because it's all he can do now to hold in his emotions. And Akane's like, are you freaking kidding me? That's not the situation. She's like, no. But he's like, this is me being by the book because it's all I can do right now. And then Masaoka's like, let's trust the navigator instead of the map data. Like, Masaoka is trying to be the bridge. He's trying to be the mediator, being like, okay, let's calm down. Let's think logically about this. And he tries to like give give Akane a little push, being like, let's get back to the situation. Let's see what we can do and use the resources that we have. Meanwhile, we have these guys getting locked into, it all ties back to this damn room. Like, this is like Saw, where the hunter is like going through trying to find everything. And then again, Shogo is the type that wants to sit on the bleachers and watch the game. He does not want to get involved until he can know that everybody's on his same level. And Uri was right. Like, she told the hunter, she told Senguji that she's like, you're going to get used just like him. And he did not take it seriously until, because I'm sure that Shogo was like, he planted all the extra stuff there to try to see what Kogami would do, right? Would he sacrifice the girl? Like, what would he end up doing? But Kogami is an amazing detective, and he's a good person at heart. So he wasn't just, he knows how tied Akane is to her. He's not just going to let her die willy-nilly and sacrifice her. That's not how it, but I think it's going to come to a head next episode. Like, is Shogo going to put Kogami in a position where he has to choose between sacrificing her, Akane's friend, to get closer to Shogo, or what? That's going to be the question. But I'm like, oh my God, like, what a cliffhanger, right? That this leads on. And so, yeah, all of the, like, the stuff that Kogami is doing, and also I like the idea that he's very clinical about this. Like, he makes her take off the clothes to find the antenna and everything, which is, again, that's such a very Saul thing. Because if he just sacrificed her to get away, he wouldn't have been able to get the antenna to get a hold of the others. So it's all of these little intricate things that Shogo's like, okay, are you going to be able to save yourself? Because I want you to live to see another day, right? He doesn't care about the hunter. He does not care about Senguji at this point. Because again, the idea of immortality to Shogo is complacent and boring. And he's done at this point. He's like, oh, no, I'm not for that. Let's get rid of you because who wants immortality? Gross. That takes care of that, takes away the whole idea of the thrill, right? The thrill of the hunt is over if everybody keeps living through everything. So at that point, I think he's like, he wants Kogami to live so he can face him himself. So he's given all these clues and devices to do so. And he believes and has faith that Kogami is capable of getting out of the situation himself. So it's weird to see that Shogo and Akane both have faith in Kogami in different ways. Obviously, Shogo's is much more sinister. So, but it's fascinating, right? Very fascinating. He's like, I wonder, and she says, I wonder if those people with the clearest psycho hues are always people like her that are able to, like, because they talk about this. He's like, he says, I think people society really need are people like her. Like, I love this part here where the friends, like, they both talk about how Akane is this rare exception, that she's somebody that has all this faith and is able to look past, like, things that would bother most people. And both Akane and Kogami have faith in her, which is so good. I'm like, I like there's just like there's like a subtle little hint that the friend is giving Kogami that, like, oh yeah, Akane thinks you're different. She kind of likes you. And he's like, really? I don't know. I'm like, I definitely I feel like Kogami's going to figure out that she likes him eventually. Even if the friend doesn't give the right clues. But I like this little moment where both of them are talking about Akane and how different she is. And how Kogami's like, society needs more people like her. And she's like, I feel like the psychopath system would be better with more people like her. It's so interesting. She's like, is it possible you're the subordinate who puts her at a loss? And he's like, what? That's what I am to her? Oh, Akane, if only you knew. And then they throw more of the glow sticks. The traps and stuff are just disgusting. Nope, they're anachronistic. Yep. And then, of course, she goes after the bag. I'm glad that so far this girl has stayed alive because I do not really want to see her get her leg blown off in any sense of the word. Nope. And then again, Kogami talks about how we're the ones being hunted. And he's like, it's like a question of would he sacrifice her to escape? But in order for him to save himself, he has to think of her too, right? It is kind of diabolical for him to put the antenna in her bra. Like, because that has to show a clear faith in her with him. Because if she didn't have faith in Kogami being sincere and not perverted, she wouldn't have let him have the bra and wouldn't have undressed in front of him if she didn't trust him. So it's a matter of trust and faith. But because they both talked about Akane, And because she realized he's the one that she's been talking about, I think that increased her faith in him. So it's so interesting how this plays out. But also, what a gentleman. Kogami is like, I just need to get the stuff that's in your bra. Just humor me here. You got my coat. I gave you my coat, which was super sweet, right? But all the stuff with the antenna and the transponder, that stuff is all things that Mikishima has done that Senguji did not plan for. Because he's like, did you add in some plot to this game that's unbeknownst to me? And Shogo's like, who, me? Tamper with the game? What? He's literally Jigsaw, right? The hunter thinks he's Jigsaw, but Shogo is really the Jigsaw in all of this. He's like, oh no, it's me. I'm definitely pulling the strings. And I think at this point, it's very clear that Shogo wants the hunter to get killed because, again, that's evidence that needs to get eliminated from the situation, from the system, that would go back to him. But he wants Kogami to get out of this alive. But he's going to test Kogami to see if he's worthy to face Shogo and his popped collar. Popped collars all around for Shogo, you know? And then he's like, well, you know, you said yourself, when man faces fear, his soul's tested. What better thrill could there be than for you to, like, face the fear of death? Like, your true nature becomes clear. Isn't that what you wanted? Like, oh, he's just such a devil, right? And he's like, Kogami, will you understand the meaning of this game? Mm-hmm. And that is the question. What is the meaning of the game? What is the meaning of the game indeed? Is it the idea of using all of the resources at your disposal? I feel like Shogo wants Kogami to be on his level and to be able to use everything at his disposal for whatever reason and be unaffected and very clinical about it. But also I'm concerned that the final aspect of the game is going to be, the final aspect I'm afraid is going to be Kogami having to kill the girl to get to Shogo. And the question is Kogami going to do that or not? And what is Akane going to think if Kogami sacrifices the friend to get closer to Shogo? Because Masaoka has dropped those little hints that according to Masaoka, all Kogami cares about is getting closer to Shogo to catch him. And so far, Kogami has been able to save the girl while trying to play the game. But is the final aspect of the game going to be that Kogami has to sacrifice her to get to him? Is he going to do that? What's Akane going to think about that? What do we do about it? So I'm a little bit worried about that if I'm being quite honest, right? And so, yeah. Then we cut back after that, after they find the antenna and everything. He's like, here's the antenna for the transponder. And it's like, thank goodness. And so, yeah, they're talking about the jamming. The range is limited, but everything's still being jammed. And it's like, where is the source of the jamming? And it's coming from the southwest. There shouldn't be anything in that section. I like that Kunozuka is kind of like Shion. She's a researcher too and a tech person. I like that little connection there, right? And Gino's like, well, we're going to set up a relay base here. Don't trust the map data. Every single gap should be checked thoroughly. And as soon as you find Kogami, then shoot him with the Dominator. You don't have to warn him. And then Akane's like, now we're not sure he ran away. So, and Gino gives the very clinical textbook answer saying, well, the Sybil system will make that decision. If his crime coefficient hasn't changed, it'll just paralyze him. If he didn't do anything wrong, then it'll just be paralyzed and it won't be an issue. If he really wanted to run, then it'll mercilessly activate the eliminator mode, right? But the thing about it is that Gino clearly knows that something's going on, like he was taken or something. So Kogami is going to be in the mindset of running away and getting away from the situation. So is the Sybil system going to be able to determine that, oh, he's trying to run away from Shogo and them, or is it going to automatically assume that him trying to run away means from them? We know the answer is going to be, it's going to determine the most clinical thing possible, not taking into account all these other factors. And so Akane's like, now really, is this really what we're needing to do? And so he's like, you can't fool the somatic scan. But there's all these coefficients we don't even know about that Akane is like, really? We can't take into account all these other things? It's going to show his true intentions. And she's like, are you saying it's okay to kill him? You used to be his friend, right? If he ends up dying, then the fault will lie on you due to your poor supervision. And that is setting up the same... See, he is mirroring the same situation with... He's saying that this is all mirroring the same stuff with Kogami and Sasayama. Because of Kogami's poor supervision, Sasayama ended up dying. But it's not the same situation. And it also seems like Ginoza is projecting some of his own insecurities on the situation because of Ginoza's poor supervision, Kogami went off to chase after Sasayama and ended up becoming an enforcer. So there's a lot of projecting that Ginoza's doing. And again, Akane's like, well, but that's not, he's adding guilt onto her. And he's like, if you had Kogami under control, then this wouldn't have had to happen. So he's projecting, saying it's her fault that Kogami's in danger. He's projecting hardcore. And that's when he's like, how do you feel about someone dying because of your own incompetency? Ginoza is projecting so much. And that's when Masaoka steps in and goes, yeah, about this. Because she's getting worried. And Masaoka's like, hey, Inspector, look. And he's like, you're getting a little too sinister. How about we stop right there? That was a bit much. Like, you're letting your own emotional state get... I feel like Masaoka's like, you're letting your own emotional state get in the way, right? Let's not do this. And Akane's like, oh. I like that Ginoza looks so like, did you just manhandle me? And Masaoka's like, let's take a step back. I think that was a bit much, isn't it? And that's when Kogami calls, speak of the devil. And I like that Kagari and Masaoka's like, thank God. He's like, we're all good, aren't we? And Akane is like, it's a code 108. And she's like, yes, he's fine. Send in reinforcements immediately. And then Gino's like, send in all the drones we have. Make sure at least one drone reaches him. I love it. I love them all going after him. Yes. So, welp. What a cliffhanger. What a cliffhanger, damn it! I love this series so much, and I'm so excited to see where it's going, but Ginoza worries me a lot, because Ginoza is like, I think Ginoza is the one teetering on the edge, and I'm like, quit making Akane feel bad. You're making her possibly get her hue clouded because of you. So I'm like, ugh. I have no doubt that Kogami is going to make it out alive, because we know from episode 1 that they face each other at some point. But the question is Kogami's actions with this hunter going to end up getting the friend killed? Is he going to end up having to run away? What do we do about this, y'all? So, I don't know. But I'm really excited, and I'm going to wait a little bit before watching the next episode. But I don't know if I'm going to be able to wait till the comments come in. I don't know. We'll see. Probably. Maybe. Who knows? In any case, I hope y'all have a wonderful week. I'm curious to hear your thoughts down below. Please stay safe. Take care. And yeah, I'll be back next week with more of Psycho Pass. Bye!